Close your eyes, settle into stillness, and let the noise of the modern world slowly drift away. Tonight, we journey back more than 2 centuries, to a time when the American frontier stretched farther than imagination. Beyond the last wooden cabins of the young United States lay a wilderness so vast that maps faded into blank spaces. Endless forests covered the mountains. Rivers flowed through valleys untouched by roads. Snow buried entire landscapes for months at a time. Wolves howled beneath brilliant stars, and grizzly bears ruled remote valleys where few human beings had ever walked. This was the world of the American mountain man. Between 1800 and 1845, a remarkable generation of explorers, hunters, trappers, and adventurers disappeared into the Rocky Mountains. They traveled thousands of miles on horseback and on foot, surviving where almost no permanent settlements existed. They crossed raging rivers, climbed frozen mountain passes, and endured winters that claimed the lives of even the strongest men. Many arrived seeking fortune. Most found something entirely different. To later generations, the mountain man became a legend, a fearless wanderer wrapped in buckskin, carrying a long rifle, living alone among towering peaks. Paintings and novels often portrayed them as heroes who conquered nature through courage and determination. The truth was far more complicated. Life in the mountains was rarely glorious. Hunger was constant. Disease spread silently through isolated camps. Accidents happened without warning, and a broken leg hundreds of miles from civilization often became a death sentence. Every decision carried consequences. Every mistake could be the last. Yet despite these hardships, thousands willingly ventured into the wilderness. Their journey began with one animal, the North American beaver. Today the beaver may seem ordinary, quietly building dams across streams and ponds. But in the early 19th century, beaver fur was among the most valuable natural resources on Earth. Across Europe and the eastern United States, fashionable gentlemen wore tall felt hats made from beaver underfur. These hats symbolized wealth, sophistication, and status. As cities grew and fashion spread, demand exploded. Merchants were willing to pay extraordinary prices for quality pelts. Entire fortunes depended upon these small animals. By the beginning of the 19th century, beaver populations in the eastern forests had already been heavily hunted. Traders and businessmen turned their eyes westward toward lands few Americans had ever seen. Beyond the Mississippi River lay an immense wilderness filled with rivers, lakes, and mountain valleys where millions of beavers still lived. Some saw danger, others saw opportunity. Powerful fur companies began organizing expeditions into the unknown. Investors supplied rifles, traps, horses, powder, blankets, trade goods, and food. In return, trappers promised to return with thousands of valuable pelts. Few understood what waited beyond the frontier. The Rocky Mountains were not simply hills rising above the plains. They formed an immense barrier stretching for nearly 3,000 miles across western North America. Jagged peaks pierced the clouds. Deep canyons split the landscape. Dense pine forests hid predators and hidden rivers alike. Snow remained on the highest summits throughout the year. Long before American trappers arrived, indigenous nations had lived within these mountains for countless generations. The Crow, the Blackfeet, the Shoshone, the Nez Perce, the Flathead, the Ute, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho. Each nation understood the land in ways newcomers could scarcely imagine. They knew where buffalo crossed the rivers each season. They recognized safe mountain passes hidden beneath snow. They understood which plants healed wounds, which streams never froze completely, and where danger waited beyond the next ridge. For every successful mountain man, native knowledge often meant the difference between life and death. Some trappers built lifelong friendships with indigenous communities. Others became enemies. Many married native women, creating families that bridged two worlds. Their stories would shape the future of the American West in ways history books often overlook. As the first expeditions pushed farther into the wilderness, another challenge quickly emerged: distance. Everything required weeks or even months of travel. Messages traveled on horseback. Supplies disappeared rapidly. Gunpowder became precious. Food spoiled. Horses collapsed from exhaustion. Once beyond the frontier settlements, there would be no stores, no doctors, no soldiers, and no guaranteed rescue. Only the mountains remained. Still they continued. One river after another. One valley after another. Every mile carried them deeper into a landscape that seemed almost endless. Few realized they were witnessing one of the final great eras of exploration in North American history. Within only a few decades, railroads, settlers, military forts, and growing towns would transform these same mountains forever. But for a brief moment in time, the wilderness still belonged mostly to nature, and the mountain men were among the few outsiders willing to call it home. Our journey into that forgotten world is only beginning. As the first rays of sunlight crept across the endless American frontier, hundreds of rivers shimmered beneath a blanket of morning mist. To most travelers, these waterways appeared ordinary. To the mountain men, they represented opportunity. Where there was flowing water, there were usually beavers. And where there were beavers, fortunes could be made. The entire economy of the Rocky Mountain fur trade revolved around a single remarkable creature. Unlike most animals hunted for meat, the beaver was prized for something far more valuable: its incredibly soft underfur. This dense layer of fur could be transformed into waterproof felt unlike anything else available at the time. Skilled hat makers in London, Paris, Boston, Philadelphia, and New York shaped the felt into elegant top hats worn by businessmen, politicians, military officers, and wealthy gentlemen. Demand seemed endless. By the early 1800s, a single prime beaver pelt could earn a trapper several dollars. An impressive sum when many laborers earned less than $1 for an entire day's work. Successful trappers sometimes returned from the mountains carrying hundreds of pelts. In today's money, their cargo could be worth tens of thousands of dollars. It sounded like easy wealth. Reality was something entirely different. Finding beavers required patience, experience, and careful observation. Mountain men learned to read rivers almost like books. Freshly chewed tree stumps revealed active colonies. Small canals carved through muddy banks hinted at busy beaver activity. Perfectly engineered dams slowed rushing streams into peaceful ponds where entire families of beavers built their remarkable homes. The trappers rarely hunted with rifles. Gunfire frightened nearby animals and wasted precious ammunition. Instead, they relied upon carefully crafted steel traps. Heavy iron jaws were hidden beneath shallow water where unsuspecting beavers traveled each evening. The trapper worked silently. Every movement mattered. A single careless footprint could alert the animals. Hours later, or sometimes the following morning, they returned. Sometimes the trap remained empty. Sometimes it held success. Sometimes it had disappeared entirely beneath floodwaters. Nature offered no guarantees. Once captured, the difficult work truly began. Each animal had to be skinned with extraordinary care. Even a small cut through the valuable fur could dramatically reduce its price. Experienced mountain men became astonishingly skilled. Within minutes, they could remove an entire pelt almost perfectly. The hides were stretched tightly across wooden frames to dry beneath the mountain sun. Day after day, dozens of drying pelts surrounded the camps. Eventually, they would be bundled into enormous packs weighing nearly 90 pounds each. These heavy loads would later be carried hundreds of miles by horse or mule across dangerous wilderness. The work never stopped. During trapping season, mountain men often spent 16 hours each day moving from one stream to another. Rain soaked their buckskin clothing. Snow covered their camps. Mosquitoes attacked relentlessly during the warmer months. Ice formed on rivers before sunrise. Yet every successful trap brought them closer to financial independence. Or so they hoped. Many newcomers dreamed of becoming rich after only one expedition. Few achieved that dream. The mountains demanded payment for every reward they offered. Steel traps rusted. Horses died. Supplies disappeared. Food became scarce. Unexpected storms trapped entire parties for weeks. One severe winter could erase years of hard-earned profits. Some trappers quietly admitted that they earned less money than skilled craftsmen living safely in eastern cities. Yet they returned to the wilderness again and again. Money alone could not explain their devotion. There was another attraction: freedom. In the mountains, no one cared about your family name. No government official watched your every move. No crowded city surrounded you. The wilderness judged everyone equally. A man survived because of his skill, his courage, and sometimes his luck. Nothing else mattered. As seasons passed, experienced mountain men developed remarkable abilities. They could predict approaching storms simply by watching distant clouds. They recognized dozens of edible plants. They understood animal tracks almost instinctively. A broken twig, a faint hoofprint, a disturbed patch of grass. Each clue revealed another story hidden within the wilderness. Many even learned several indigenous languages, allowing them to trade peacefully with native nations whose knowledge often proved invaluable. Some mountain men eventually became guides instead of trappers. Others explored unmapped valleys. Some carried messages across impossible distances. A few disappeared into the wilderness forever, choosing mountain life over civilization itself. But while the trappers focused on rivers and forests, powerful businessmen watched from hundreds of miles away. They realized that whoever controlled the fur trade could control enormous wealth. Competition soon became fierce. Rival companies raced deeper into the wilderness. Each sought untouched valleys before their competitors arrived. The race for beaver pelts had begun, and before long, it would reshape the American West forever. The further west the trappers traveled, the more the world they knew began to disappear. The last cabins faded behind them. The final wagon roads ended. Beyond that point stretched a landscape unlike anything most Americans had ever imagined. Before them rose the Rocky Mountains, a vast chain of rugged peaks extending for nearly 3,000 miles from present-day New Mexico into what is now Canada. Some summits climbed higher than 14,000 feet. Their snow-covered peaks remained white even during the warmest days of summer. To newcomers, the mountains appeared almost impossible to cross. To the mountain men, they became home. Every spring, as rivers thawed and mountain passes slowly opened, trapping brigades pushed westward. They traveled on horseback whenever possible. When trails vanished, they continued on foot. Each man carried only what he absolutely needed: a long rifle, steel traps, a hunting knife, powder and lead, a blanket, simple cooking equipment, a few personal belongings. Everything else depended upon nature. The first weeks of every expedition were often the easiest. Game remained plentiful. Weather stayed mild. Spirits remained high. Campfires echoed with laughter and stories from previous seasons. Young trappers dreamed of becoming legends. Veterans remained far quieter. They understood what lay ahead. The mountains tested everyone. Without warning, warm sunshine could disappear beneath dark clouds. Violent thunderstorms swept across the valleys. Lightning struck isolated peaks. Hailstones the size of walnuts battered horses and men alike. By nightfall, temperatures could fall below freezing even during summer. Winter arrived early in the high country. Snow blocked mountain passes. Entire valleys disappeared beneath deep drifts. Rivers froze solid. The wilderness became deadly. Many expeditions established temporary winter camps. Cabins built from pine logs offered limited protection against the bitter cold. Smoke drifted slowly from stone fireplaces. Inside, buckskin clothing hung beside the flames to dry. Steel traps were repaired. Moccasins were stitched by hand. Rifles cleaned carefully. Outside, the world turned silent. Snow absorbed nearly every sound. Only the distant howl of wolves disturbed the frozen night. Food became the greatest concern. Mountain men hunted elk, deer, buffalo, bighorn sheep, sometimes even bears. Every successful hunt meant survival. Every failed hunt increased the danger. Unlike settlers living on farms, trappers could never depend upon stored harvests. Nature decided everything. Many became astonishing marksmen. They learned to remain perfectly still for hours. A single rifle shot had to count. Powder could not be wasted. Lead bullets could not easily be replaced. Some hunters became so skilled they could strike distant targets with remarkable accuracy using nothing more than experience and instinct. Yet hunger remained a constant companion. During harsh winters, even experienced mountain men sometimes survived on little more than dried meat and melted snow. Coffee became a luxury. Sugar almost disappeared. Fresh vegetables were nearly impossible to find. Months passed without tasting bread. Scurvy occasionally appeared. So did exhaustion. But the greatest enemy often remained invisible. Loneliness. Weeks could pass without seeing another human being outside their own small party. Some expeditions separated to cover greater distances. A trapper might spend several days entirely alone. Only endless forests surrounded him. Towering cliffs, frozen rivers, silent valleys. Even the strongest men admitted that complete isolation affected the mind. Campfires became more than warmth. They became companionship. Stories filled the darkness. Old adventures grew larger with every telling. Legends of hidden valleys, lost Spanish gold, giant bears, unknown mountain passes. Some tales were true. Others became impossible to separate from myth. Every mountain man carried his own stories. Some never shared them. Occasionally the wilderness revealed breathtaking beauty. Golden sunlight illuminated snow-covered peaks. Crystal-clear lakes reflected towering mountains without a single ripple. Millions of stars stretched across skies untouched by city lights. Northern lights sometimes shimmered above distant horizons. The silence itself became unforgettable. Many mountain men later admitted they missed these moments more than the money they earned. Civilization felt crowded after years spent beneath open skies. Yet beneath that beauty remained constant danger. A horse could slip on loose rock. A river crossing could turn deadly within seconds. One wrong trail might lead toward an impassable canyon. Every sunrise brought uncertainty. Every sunset meant another successful day survived. As the trapping brigades pushed deeper into the Rockies, they entered lands controlled by powerful indigenous nations. Some welcomed peaceful trade. Others viewed armed strangers with understandable suspicion. The next stage of the mountain man story would not be written by nature alone. It would depend upon diplomacy, trust, and sometimes war. As the mountain men pushed farther into the vast wilderness, they quickly discovered an important truth. No one truly conquered the Rocky Mountains alone. Long before American trappers crossed the Mississippi, countless indigenous nations had already mastered these landscapes over thousands of years. Every valley had a history. Every river had a name. Every mountain pass carried stories that stretched back through generations. To many newcomers, the wilderness appeared empty. It was anything but. The Crow hunted across the northern plains. The Shoshone traveled through mountain valleys that outsiders could barely navigate. The Nez Perce raised remarkable horses. The Flathead maintained peaceful trade networks. The Ute moved across the southern Rockies with extraordinary knowledge of the land. The Blackfeet controlled vast territories farther north. Each nation possessed deep knowledge that no map could ever capture. Mountain men soon realized that survival often depended upon building relationships with these communities. Many arrived carrying trade goods, bright cloth, metal tools, knives, cooking pots, needles, mirror glass, tobacco, gunpowder, lead. In return, indigenous hunters offered horses, dried buffalo meat, medicinal plants, warm robes, and perhaps most valuable of all, knowledge. Knowledge could never be purchased. It had to be earned. Experienced native guides knew where rivers could safely be crossed. They recognized hidden mountain passes buried beneath snow. They understood which berries could be eaten, which roots cured sickness, which valleys flooded during spring, which trails should never be followed. Without this wisdom, many expeditions would have disappeared forever. Some mountain men learned native languages surprisingly well. Communication reduced misunderstandings. Friendships slowly developed. Shared meals replaced suspicion. Trade created trust. Not every meeting ended peacefully. Competition over hunting grounds sometimes led to conflict. Misunderstandings could escalate rapidly when neither side understood the other's customs. Fear often created violence where none had been intended. The Blackfeet, in particular, fiercely defended their territory. For generations they had depended upon the rich hunting grounds of the northern Rockies. When increasing numbers of trappers entered those valleys, tensions grew. Several bloody encounters followed. Mountain men soon learned that certain regions demanded constant vigilance. Traveling alone became dangerous. Even successful trapping parties occasionally disappeared without explanation. Stories spread around evening campfires. Some stories were true. Others became exaggerated with every passing season. Yet nearly every veteran agreed upon one lesson: respect the people who know the mountains. Among the most remarkable relationships were those formed through marriage. Many mountain men married native women. These marriages were often practical. They were also deeply personal. Native wives brought invaluable survival knowledge. They prepared hides into warm clothing, collected edible plants, cared for horses, helped negotiate with neighboring tribes, raised children who grew up speaking multiple languages and understanding two very different cultures. One of the most famous examples was Jim Bridger. Like several other mountain men, Bridger married into native communities and developed lifelong relationships that shaped both his personal life and his remarkable career. These families became bridges between civilizations. Their children inherited traditions from both worlds. Today, many descendants still preserve those remarkable histories. As years passed, experienced mountain men became respected visitors among certain indigenous communities. Seasonal trading became almost expected. Stories were exchanged beside campfires. Young hunters demonstrated remarkable horsemanship. Children laughed while curious trappers attempted unfamiliar native games. Music drifted across evening camps. Despite cultural differences, moments of genuine friendship often flourished. But peace remained fragile. As more Americans pushed westward, pressure upon indigenous lands steadily increased. The fur trade brought opportunity. It also brought disease, new technologies, new rivalries, and eventually, many native leaders understood what few mountain men fully recognized. The arrival of trappers was only the beginning. Behind them would come settlers, farmers, soldiers, roads, forts, railroads. The wilderness itself would change forever. Most mountain men did not intend to reshape an entire continent. They simply wanted beaver pelts, adventure, freedom. Yet history often moves through ordinary people without asking their permission. Every new trail they discovered, every river they mapped, every mountain pass they crossed, made it easier for thousands of others to follow. Without realizing it, the mountain men were opening the American West. And soon, the greatest gathering of trappers in history would bring them all together in one extraordinary place. By the mid-1820s, the mountain men had solved one of the greatest problems of frontier life. It was not hunger. It was not snow. It was not hostile territory. It was distance. A trapper might spend 8 or 9 months alone in the mountains collecting valuable beaver pelts. By spring, His horses carried hundreds of pounds of dried furs. But there was one enormous problem. How could those pelts be sold? Returning all the way to St. Louis meant traveling more than 1,000 miles through dangerous wilderness. The journey wasted precious time. It exhausted horses. It reduced profits. Then one businessman imagined a completely different solution. Instead of bringing the trappers back to civilization, civilization would travel to the trappers. Thus was born one of the most remarkable traditions in American frontier history, the Rocky Mountain Rendezvous. Every summer, somewhere deep within the Rocky Mountains, thousands of people gathered in places that only months earlier had been completely empty wilderness. The exact location changed every year, sometimes beside a broad river, sometimes in a high mountain valley, sometimes near rich grasslands where thousands of horses could graze. Messengers spread the location months in advance. Experienced mountain men always knew where to go. By early summer, the wilderness slowly came alive. Long columns of pack mules appeared first, then heavily loaded wagons. Fur company caravans wound through mountain passes carrying supplies worth fortunes. Soon after came the trappers themselves. Some arrived alone. Others traveled in small brigades. Many had not seen another white settlement for nearly a year. The moment they entered camp, the atmosphere transformed completely. The silence of the mountains disappeared. Hundreds of campfires filled the valley. Thousands of horses grazed nearby. Voices echoed in English, French, Spanish, and several indigenous languages. Blacksmiths hammered glowing iron late into the night. Merchants unpacked crates filled with goods that had not been seen for months. Fresh rifles, steel traps, blankets, knives, axes, powder, lead, coffee, sugar, tobacco, colorful cloth, needles, medicine, even whiskey. For many mountain men, simply drinking fresh coffee after months in the wilderness felt like luxury. Then came the trading. Bundles of carefully prepared beaver pelts were stacked into enormous piles. Company buyers inspected every hide. They examined thickness, color, condition. Quality determined the price. Some trappers smiled with satisfaction. Others quietly realized an entire year's work had earned far less than expected. Debts were common. Many had purchased supplies on credit before leaving civilization. Now those debts had to be repaid. Sometimes little money remained. Yet disappointment rarely lasted long. The rendezvous became famous for something else. Celebration. After months of isolation, the gathering exploded with life. Fiddles played late into the evening. Men danced around campfires. Horse races thundered across open meadows. Shooting competitions tested remarkable marksmanship. Stories grew taller with every passing hour. Each trapper claimed to have survived a greater storm, shot a larger grizzly, or discovered a richer valley than anyone else. Laughter filled the mountain air. Even rival companies often relaxed for a few brief days. Indigenous communities also arrived in great numbers. Families reunited. Friendships were renewed. Marriage ceremonies sometimes took place during the gathering. It became the social heart of the entire Rocky Mountain fur trade. Here, newcomers listened carefully to experienced veterans. They learned which rivers still held large beaver populations, which valleys had become dangerous, which mountain passes remained open. News traveled astonishing distances. Political changes in Washington, economic news from New York, events in Europe. Everything eventually reached the mountains. For a few unforgettable weeks, the wilderness became one of the busiest places in North America. Among those wandering through these remarkable gatherings were men whose names would eventually become legends. Jim Bridger, Kit Carson, Jedediah Smith, William Sublette, Thomas Fitzpatrick. Many were still young, but beneath the music, the trading, and the celebration, The rivers held fewer beavers than they once had. The easiest trapping grounds were disappearing. Without realizing it, the mountain men were celebrating during the final golden years of the fur trade. The greatest adventure of their lives was already beginning to fade. Among all the legendary mountain men, one name stood apart. Not because he trapped the most beavers, not because he earned the greatest fortune, but because he ventured where almost no one else dared to go. His name was Jedediah Smith. Born in New York in 1799, Smith grew up reading books about geography, exploration, and the unknown. Unlike many frontiersmen who received little formal education, he developed an unusual fascination with maps. Blank spaces on paper did not frighten him. They invited him. In his early 20s, Smith joined General William Ashley's Rocky Mountain Fur Company, a business that was actively recruiting adventurous young men willing to risk everything for opportunity. The advertisement was simple. Enterprising young men. That was all it took. Smith answered the call. Within only a few years, he had become one of Ashley's most trusted leaders. While many trappers focused only on collecting pelts, Smith constantly searched for new routes through the mountains. Every unexplored valley interested him. Every distant peak raised another question. What lay beyond it? His curiosity would reshape maps of the American West forever. One expedition after another carried Smith farther from familiar territory. He crossed mountain ranges that few Americans had ever seen. He entered deserts many believed were impossible to survive. He carefully recorded rivers, lakes, and mountain passes with remarkable precision. Years later, thousands of emigrants would unknowingly follow trails first explored by Smith. Yet exploration came with extraordinary danger. One autumn afternoon, while traveling through thick brush, Smith's party unexpectedly encountered a massive grizzly bear. The attack happened almost instantly. The enormous animal charged directly toward him. Before Smith could properly raise his rifle, the bear struck. His powerful claws ripped across his body. Its jaws seized his head with terrifying force. Companions watched in horror. The grizzly tore away part of Smith's scalp and one of his ears before fellow trappers finally killed the animal. Most men would have died. Smith survived. His companions carefully stitched his scalp back into place using crude frontier methods. There were no hospitals, no surgeons, no modern medicine, only determination. Within weeks, he was traveling again. The scars remained for the rest of his life, but they never slowed him. Smith's greatest achievements came not through combat, but through persistence. He became one of the first Americans to cross the Sierra Nevada mountains from east to west. He explored much of present-day California long before it became part of the United States. He journeyed through the Great Basin, proving that enormous regions previously believed impossible to cross could, in fact, be traversed with enough preparation and courage. Again and again, Smith accomplished what others considered impossible. His journals revealed another remarkable quality: respect. Unlike many stories that later exaggerated frontier violence, Smith frequently sought peaceful relationships with indigenous communities. He understood that survival often depended upon communication rather than conflict. Not every meeting ended peacefully. Some encounters became dangerous. Others resulted in valuable exchanges of knowledge. Smith never assumed he understood lands that others had called home for generations. His maps gradually transformed American understanding of the West. Rivers once drawn incorrectly suddenly appeared in accurate locations. Mountain passes became known. Deserts once considered impassable revealed hidden routes. His work quietly influenced explorers, traders, soldiers, and eventually thousands of settlers moving west. Yet fame meant very little to him. Unlike many adventurous figures remembered today, Smith rarely sought glory. He remained deeply religious throughout his life. Friends often described him as calm, thoughtful, and remarkably disciplined. He avoided heavy drinking that became common during the annual rendezvous. He preferred planning tomorrow's journey rather than celebrating today's success. But the wilderness rarely rewarded caution forever. In 1831, while traveling across the lonely plains near the Santa Fe Trail, Smith became separated from his companions. Somewhere in the vast emptiness, he disappeared. When others eventually found the scene, it became clear he had been killed during an encounter with Comanche warriors. He was only 32 years old. His body vanished into the immense landscape he had spent his life exploring. Yet his influence never disappeared. The routes he discovered became highways of westward expansion. The maps he helped create opened lands once thought unreachable. And his quiet determination became one of the defining stories of the mountain man era. Long after his footsteps faded from the wilderness, America continued walking the trails he had found. If Jedediah Smith was the explorer, then Jim Bridger became the man who truly belonged to the mountains. Born in Virginia in 1804 and raised near the growing frontier city of St. Louis, Bridger was only 17 years old when he answered William Ashley's famous call for enterprising young men. Like many others, he expected adventure. He found a completely different life. Within only a few years, Bridger had become one of the most capable mountain men in the entire West. He learned quickly how to survive blizzards, how to read the weather, how to follow animal tracks across frozen ground, how to find water in dry country, how to remain calm when everything around him seemed determined to kill him. Unlike newcomers who constantly fought against nature, Bridger learned to work with it. His greatest teacher was experience. Every mistake became a lesson. Every winter made him stronger. Every mountain pass expanded his understanding of the American West. Soon, few men knew the Rocky Mountains better. Bridger possessed an extraordinary memory. He could ride through unfamiliar country only once and remember nearly every important landmark years later. He recognized distant peaks from dozens of miles away. He remembered hidden springs that appeared only during certain seasons. He knew where buffalo gathered, where snow lingered longest, where rivers flooded each spring. To later emigrants, Jim Bridger became something more valuable than any printed map. He became a living guidebook. Yet Bridger was also famous for something else: his stories. Few frontier storytellers matched his imagination. Around evening campfires, he entertained companions with unbelievable tales. He described rivers so strange they flowed backward, forests where birds spoke like people, mountains filled with glowing rocks. One famous story claimed he had discovered a lake where fish were already cooked when they reached the shore because the water boiled naturally. Many listeners laughed. Years later, explorers entered what is now Yellowstone National Park. There they found boiling rivers, steam erupting from the earth, hot springs, geysers unlike anything previously imagined. Suddenly, Bridger's impossible stories did not seem quite so impossible. He had simply struggled to describe landscapes no one back east could believe existed. Like many mountain men, Bridger built close relationships with indigenous nations. He married native women and raised a family deeply connected to both cultures. His knowledge grew not only through exploration but through friendship and cooperation. He respected local traditions. He listened carefully. He understood that survival depended as much upon people as upon skill. As the years passed, the fur trade slowly declined. Many mountain men disappeared into history. Bridger adapted. Instead of trapping, he became a guide. Military officers hired him. Government expeditions trusted him. Scientists relied upon him. Wagon trains filled with hopeful settlers followed trails that Bridger knew almost by heart. Thousands of families crossed the continent because experienced guides like him led the way. In 1843, Bridger established one of the most famous frontier outposts in American history, Fort Bridger. Located in present-day Wyoming, the fort quickly became a vital stop along the Oregon Trail, California Trail, and later the Mormon Trail. Travelers arrived exhausted after weeks on the open plains. At Fort Bridger they repaired wagons, rested horses, exchanged news, prepared for the even more dangerous journey ahead. The lonely mountain man had become a businessman. Whenever possible, Bridger returned to the mountains he loved. Even after decades of exploration, they still filled him with wonder. But the world around him had changed. Now thousands of wagons rolled westward each year. Cabins appeared where untouched forests had stood. Roads widened. Military forts expanded. The frontier was disappearing. Bridger understood this perhaps better than anyone. He had explored the wilderness before maps existed. Now he watched civilization follow the very routes he had helped reveal. In later years, visitors often sought him out. They wanted stories, advice, directions. They wanted to hear about the days when the mountains were still truly wild. Bridger rarely exaggerated his own achievements. He simply smiled, remembered, and quietly described a world that no longer existed. The age of the mountain man was slowly coming to an end. But before it vanished forever, another legendary figure would emerge. A young trapper named Kit Carson, a man whose name would become known across the entire nation. By the time Christopher Kit Carson entered the Rocky Mountains, the era of the mountain men had already reached its peak. Yet few individuals would become more closely associated with the American frontier. Unlike the towering legends that later surrounded his name, Carson himself was surprisingly quiet. He rarely sought attention. He seldom boasted. Those who knew him described a man of few words, calm under pressure, and remarkably dependable. Born in Kentucky in 1809, Carson's family moved west while he was still a child. Life on the frontier demanded maturity at an early age. His father died when Kit was young, leaving the family struggling to survive. Formal education quickly became impossible. Instead, Carson learned practical skills. How to ride, how to hunt, how to repair equipment, how to endure hardship without complaint. At just 16 years old, he made a decision that would change his life forever. Without telling his family, Carson quietly joined a merchant caravan heading west along the Santa Fe Trail. It was one of the busiest trade routes in North America. Stretching for nearly 900 miles between Missouri and Santa Fe, the trail crossed vast prairies, dry plains, and dangerous river crossings. For many young men, the journey ended in New Mexico. For Kit Carson, it was only the beginning. He soon abandoned ordinary trade work and entered the world of the mountain men. The wilderness suited him perfectly. Unlike crowded towns filled with noise and politics, the mountains rewarded patience. Carson possessed extraordinary endurance. He could ride for days with little rest. He traveled lightly. He wasted neither ammunition nor words. Experienced trappers quickly recognized his ability. Within only a few seasons, Carson had become one of the finest hunters and scouts in the Rockies. His greatest strength was observation. Nothing escaped his attention. Fresh tracks pressed into soft earth. Broken branches. Smoke rising far beyond distant hills. Changes in bird calls. The direction of the wind. Each tiny detail revealed information invisible to less experienced travelers. Carson also developed close relationships with several indigenous nations. He learned multiple native languages with remarkable fluency. Communication became one of his greatest advantages. Rather than relying upon force whenever difficulties appeared, Carson often preferred conversation. His willingness to understand different cultures earned him respect throughout much of the frontier. Like many mountain men, Carson married native women and built a family connected to both worlds. Those relationships deepened his understanding of Western North America far beyond what maps alone could provide. As the years passed, Carson gradually shifted away from trapping. The beaver trade no longer offered the opportunities it once had. Instead, he found new work as a guide. His reputation spread across the frontier. Government officials requested his services. Military expeditions sought his experience. Scientists depended upon his knowledge of unfamiliar terrain. Perhaps the most famous partnership of Carson's career began in 1842. That year, explorer John C. Fremont hired him as chief guide for an ambitious expedition into the American West. Fremont possessed scientific training and political experience. Together they crossed deserts, mountains, rivers, and forests that few Americans had ever explored in detail. While Fremont wrote reports and produced maps that became famous throughout the United States, Carson quietly ensured the expeditions survived, found safe river crossings, guided exhausted men through blizzards, negotiated with indigenous communities. Without skilled guides like Kit Carson, many celebrated expeditions might never have returned home. As newspapers published Fremont's reports, millions of Americans became fascinated by the western frontier. They became destinations. Ironically, Carson's remarkable success as a guide helped accelerate the very changes that would eventually end the mountain man era. The trails became roads. The camps became towns. The wilderness slowly retreated. Carson witnessed the transformation with mixed emotions. He had spent years living in a world where silence stretched across hundreds of miles. Smoke from settlements rose where only campfires had once burned. The frontier that had shaped his life was disappearing before his eyes. Still, Carson continued adapting, because survival had always depended upon one simple truth. The mountains never rewarded those who refused to change. And neither did history. As America expanded toward the Pacific Ocean, another force began reshaping the frontier. It was no longer driven by fur. It was driven by destiny. The age of exploration was giving way to the age of expansion. And with it, the world of the mountain men would never be the same. By the early 1840s, something extraordinary was happening across the young United States. The mountain men had spent decades exploring the wilderness. Now, thousands of ordinary families prepared to follow the trails they had discovered. For years, the West had seemed unimaginably distant. Most Americans would never see the Rocky Mountains. Many believed the journey was simply too dangerous, too long, too uncertain. But stories traveled east. Explorers returned with maps. Missionaries described fertile valleys beyond the mountains. Merchants spoke of endless grasslands. Hunters told stories of rivers overflowing with fish and plains covered by immense buffalo herds. Newspapers transformed these stories into dreams. A new belief began spreading across the nation. Many Americans came to believe that their country was destined to stretch from the Atlantic Ocean all the way to the Pacific. This idea would later become known as manifest destiny. Whether viewed as opportunity or expansion, it encouraged thousands to leave everything behind in search of a new future. Entire communities began preparing for one of the greatest migrations in American history. Farmers sold their land. Families packed their belongings into sturdy wooden wagons. Blacksmiths repaired wagon wheels. Carpenters strengthened axles. Children gathered precious keepsakes. Parents carefully chose what would remain behind forever. Every wagon carried someone's hopes, someone's memories, someone's future. The journey ahead measured more than 2,000 miles. It would take 4 to 6 months under ideal conditions. Many travelers had never spent a single night away from settled communities. Now they prepared to cross deserts, rivers, mountains, and endless plains. The Oregon Trail soon became the most famous road west. Yet calling it a road hardly seemed accurate. Most of the route consisted of little more than wagon tracks crossing open prairie. Dust filled the air. Summer heat exhausted both people and animals. Spring rains transformed the trail into thick mud. River crossings terrified nearly everyone. Unlike modern bridges, many rivers offered no safe passage. Families floated wagons across using makeshift rafts. Oxen struggled against powerful currents. Supplies occasionally disappeared beneath the water. Sometimes entire wagons overturned. The loss of food or ammunition could threaten an entire expedition. Disease proved even more dangerous. Crowded wagon trains created perfect conditions for illness. Healthy travelers sometimes became gravely ill within hours. Simple dehydration claimed countless lives. Small wooden crosses gradually appeared beside the trail. Silent reminders of those who never reached their destination. Experienced mountain men became invaluable. Men like Jim Bridger and Kit Carson knew where water could be found. They understood which mountain passes remained open. They recognized dangerous river crossings before disaster struck. Without their knowledge, many wagon trains might have vanished into the wilderness. Some guided emigrants personally. Others established trading posts where weary travelers could rest. Fort Bridger quickly became one of the most important stops in the entire journey west. There, exhausted families repaired broken wagons, purchased fresh supplies, asked questions that only experienced frontiersmen could answer. How much farther? Will the snow arrive early? Are there hostile encounters ahead? The mountain men had become teachers, not because they planned to, but because no one else possessed their experience. Yet many of them watched these wagon trains with mixed emotions. Only a few years earlier, the valleys had been silent. Now hundreds of wagons rolled west every season. The wilderness they loved was beginning to disappear. Trees fell to build cabins. Grasslands became farms. Game animals slowly retreated deeper into the mountains. The transformation happened faster than anyone expected. Even the annual Rocky Mountain Rendezvous began to change. Fewer trappers arrived. More merchants appeared. Business shifted away from beaver pelts toward serving settlers moving west. The old world faded quietly. A new America was taking shape. The mountain men had unknowingly become the first guides of a national migration. Their lonely trails had become highways. Their camps had become towns. Their discoveries had become the foundation of westward expansion. But while settlers pushed toward new homes, one final enemy threatened to destroy the very profession that had started it all. It was not war. It was not winter. It was not the mountains. It was fashion. And that unexpected change would bring the great era of the mountain men to its dramatic conclusion. For nearly 4 decades, the mountain men had lived by a simple truth. Where there were beavers, there was opportunity. Their lives revolved around rivers, steel traps, and long winters in the wilderness. Entire companies had been built upon the fur trade. Thousands of men had crossed the continent because of it. But history has an unusual habit. Sometimes enormous eras come to an end for surprisingly ordinary reasons. The mountain man era did not collapse because every beaver disappeared. It did not end because the mountains became too dangerous. Nor did it end because the trappers suddenly lost their courage. Instead, it began in the fashionable streets of Europe. By the early 1840s, clothing styles were changing. For generations, wealthy gentlemen had worn elegant hats made from beaver felt. They were expensive, durable, waterproof, and enormously popular. But fashion rarely stands still. Silk hats suddenly became the newest symbol of wealth and sophistication. Unlike beaver felt hats, silk hats possessed a smooth, glossy finish that reflected light beautifully. They were lighter, more fashionable, and increasingly affordable to manufacture. Almost overnight, demand for beaver fur began to fall. Merchants who had once competed fiercely for every shipment of pelts now offered lower prices. Trading companies reduced their orders. Investors became cautious. For the mountain men, the consequences were immediate. A trapper who once earned enough pelts to support himself for an entire season now found that the same hard work produced only a fraction of the income. Nothing about the wilderness had changed. The rivers still flowed. The mountains still stood. The beavers still built their dams. Only the marketplace had changed. Yet there was another problem. By this time, many of the richest trapping grounds had already been exhausted. For decades, thousands of trappers had harvested beavers from the same river systems. The animals reproduced slowly. Nature could no longer replace them fast enough. Each season required traveling farther into more remote country. Some companies attempted to continue. Others quietly closed their operations. The famous Rocky Mountain Fur Company dissolved. American Fur Company reduced its western activities. Independent trappers struggled to survive. Many finally accepted what had once seemed impossible. The age of the professional mountain man was ending. Some refused to believe it. They returned to the mountains one final time, hoping to rediscover the prosperity of earlier years. The wilderness that had once rewarded experience now offered little profit. Others chose a different path. Jim Bridger transformed himself into a guide and businessman. Kit Carson became an explorer, scout, and government guide. Thomas Fitzpatrick entered diplomacy. Several former trappers opened trading posts that served the growing stream of immigrants moving west. A handful married into native communities and never returned permanently to American settlements. The frontier itself was changing. Where lonely trapping camps had once stood,
permanent unappeared.
Where buffalo trails crossed the plains, wagon roads widened. Military forts rose along important routes. Mission churches welcomed new settlers. Surveyors divided the landscape into farms and future cities. The wilderness that had defined the mountain men slowly gave way to a new America. Many old trappers watched these changes with mixed emotions. They understood progress. They appreciated opportunity. But they also remembered something that newer arrivals never could. They remembered silence. They remembered valleys where no wagon wheel had ever turned. They remembered rivers untouched by bridges. That world had nearly vanished. Within a single generation, the American frontier had changed forever. The mountain men had never intended to become historical figures. Most simply wanted adventure, freedom, and perhaps enough money to build a better future. Yet their journeys accomplished something far greater. Discovered new routes through impossible mountains, connected distant cultures, and unknowingly prepared the way for one of the greatest migrations in American history. The era of the mountain men had ended, but their legacy was only beginning. By the middle of the 1840s, the American frontier had become almost unrecognizable. The great trapping brigades were disappearing. The annual Rocky Mountain Rendezvous, once the beating heart of the wilderness, had grown quieter with each passing year. The laughter still echoed around campfires. The fiddles still played. But something had changed. The old faces were growing older. The young men arriving from the east no longer dreamed of becoming trappers. They dreamed of owning land, building farms, starting towns. The wilderness was no longer a destination. It had become a pathway. Thousands of wagons now rolled west every spring. Entire families crossed rivers that only mountain men had once dared to approach. Children played beside campfires where seasoned trappers had once sharpened their knives. Churches appeared. Schools followed. Then blacksmith shops, general stores, post offices. Within only a few years, isolated frontier camps evolved into permanent settlements. For the mountain men, this transformation brought conflicting emotions. Many welcomed the comforts of civilization. Others felt like strangers in a rapidly changing world. After spending decades living beneath open skies, crowded towns felt almost suffocating. The endless conversations, the noisy streets, the strict routines, everything seemed unfamiliar. Some tried to settle down. A few became ranchers. Several found work guiding immigrant wagon trains through dangerous mountain passes. Their knowledge remained priceless. No printed map could replace years of first-hand experience. Jim Bridger continued leading military expeditions and surveying parties through the Rockies. Kit Carson became one of the most respected scouts in the American Southwest. Thomas Fitzpatrick helped negotiate agreements between the United States government and indigenous nations. Their roles had changed, but their importance had not. Meanwhile, many lesser-known mountain men quietly disappeared from history. Some settled in remote valleys with native families. Others returned east carrying little more than memories. A surprising number simply vanished. Their graves remain scattered across lonely mountain ridges, forgotten riverbanks, and hidden forests. Others received no marker at all. Nature slowly reclaimed every trace. Yet the mountains remembered. Old trapping cabins collapsed beneath heavy snow. Wooden beaver traps rusted beside forgotten streams. Campfire rings disappeared beneath growing grass. But not every legacy vanished. The maps survived. The knowledge survived. Routes first explored by the mountain men became the Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Mormon Trail. Later, many evolved into railroads, then highways. Some modern roads still follow paths first discovered by solitary trappers nearly 2 centuries ago. Their influence reached far beyond geography. The mountain men helped introduce Americans to landscapes that had previously existed only as rumors. They proved that wagons could cross the Rocky Mountains. They demonstrated that the Great Basin was not an endless wasteland. They identified rivers, mountain passes, and fertile valleys that later supported millions of settlers. Without intending to, they became the first great guides of Western expansion. Yet perhaps their greatest achievement was something impossible to measure. They transformed fear into curiosity. Before their expeditions, much of the American West remained mysterious. People imagined endless deserts, impassable mountains, hostile wilderness beyond human survival. They spoke of towering forests, crystal-clear rivers, immense wildlife, hidden valleys overflowing with life. Their adventures inspired countless others to venture west. Not all those journeys ended well. Many brought conflict. Many brought hardship. Many forever changed the lives of indigenous peoples who had long called these lands home. History rarely offers simple heroes or villains. Instead, it presents people making difficult choices in extraordinary times. The mountain men were no exception. They were explorers, hunters, traders, guides, sometimes diplomats, sometimes fighters, always survivors. And although their era had nearly ended, the myths surrounding them were only beginning. Soon, novelists and traveling storytellers would transform these rugged frontiersmen into some of the greatest legends in American history. By the late 1840s, the true age of the mountain men had passed into history. Yet something remarkable was happening. As the real wilderness slowly disappeared, the legends grew larger. Stories that had once been told around lonely campfires now spread across the growing United States. Newspapers printed dramatic accounts of fearless hunters battling enormous grizzly bears. Traveling storytellers described impossible journeys through frozen mountain passes. Artists painted rugged frontiersmen standing alone beneath towering peaks, rifles resting on their shoulders as endless wilderness stretched behind them. Some stories were true. Many were exaggerated. A few were entirely imagined. But together, they created one of the most enduring legends in American history. The mountain man became more than a profession. He became a symbol. To many Americans, he represented courage, self-reliance, freedom, adventure, the belief that one determined individual could survive almost anywhere on Earth. Adventure books filled bookstores across the country. Young readers dreamed of crossing wild rivers and climbing snow-covered mountains. Children carved wooden rifles and imagined themselves following buffalo across the Great Plains. For many people who would never leave the eastern cities, the mountain men represented an America that still felt limitless. Painters also played an important role. Artists like Alfred Jacob Miller traveled west and carefully sketched scenes from the annual Rocky Mountain Rendezvous. Although often romanticized, these works preserved valuable glimpses of a disappearing world. Meanwhile, photography was beginning to emerge. Within only a few decades, cameras would capture images of places the first mountain men had explored entirely alone. Ironically, many of the landscapes once considered unimaginably remote soon became destinations for tourists. Yellowstone, the Rocky Mountains, the Green River Valley. Millions now visit these extraordinary places every year. Few realize that long before roads, hotels, or national parks existed, mountain men crossed the same valleys carrying little more than a rifle, a horse, and a handful of steel traps. Yet history also became more complicated. Modern historians began asking difficult questions. What did westward expansion mean for indigenous nations? Could economic opportunity justify environmental destruction? The answers were rarely simple. The mountain men did not act alone. American companies sought profit. Governments pursued expansion. Indigenous communities adapted, resisted, traded, and survived in different ways. Today, historians increasingly recognize that the story of the American West cannot be told through only one perspective. The mountain men remain central figures, but so do the native nations whose ancestors had lived in these landscapes for countless generations. Without indigenous knowledge, many famous expeditions would never have survived. Without indigenous trade networks, much of the fur economy could not have existed. Without indigenous diplomacy, large portions of the frontier might have remained closed to newcomers for far longer. The true history is richer, more complex, and ultimately more fascinating than the simple legends once printed in adventure novels. Even so, there is something timeless about the image of a lone rider disappearing into the mountains at sunrise. A horse quietly walking beside a cold river. Morning mist rising through ancient pine forests. The silence broken only by flowing water and the call of an eagle high above. For just a brief moment, the modern world disappears, and it becomes possible to imagine what those first mountain men experienced. Not endless excitement, not constant danger, but something much quieter. A life lived entirely according to the rhythms of nature. A life where every sunrise brought uncertainty, every trail promised discovery, and every mountain beyond the horizon invited one more journey. Although the frontier itself has vanished, the spirit continues to echo through the American landscape. In rivers, in forests, in forgotten trails, and in the enduring stories of the men who once called the wilderness home. As the years passed, the mountains grew quieter. Not because the rivers had stopped flowing. Not because the winds no longer swept across the high peaks. But because the men who had once called those mountains home were slowly disappearing. By the late 1840s, very few true mountain men remained. The annual rendezvous had ended. The fur companies had vanished. The great caravans that once carried thousands of beaver pelts back east had become memories. In their place came something entirely different. Surveyors arrived carrying measuring instruments instead of traps. Engineers followed with plans for roads. Military officers established new forts along important routes. Soon after came merchants, ranchers, miners, and thousands upon thousands of settlers. The wilderness was changing into a nation. The transformation happened with astonishing speed. Valleys that had echoed only with elk and wolves now rang with the sound of hammers. Forests were cleared. Bridges crossed rivers. The frontier that had once seemed endless was becoming increasingly familiar. Many former mountain men watched these changes in silence. Some accepted them. Others quietly rode farther into the remaining wilderness, searching for places that still looked as they had 20 years before. Each year, those places became harder to find. Buffalo herds, once numbering in the millions, began to shrink. Beaver colonies recovered in some valleys but disappeared entirely from others. The great migration routes of wildlife were interrupted by fences, roads, and permanent settlements. The landscape itself remained beautiful, but it was no longer untouched. Some mountain men found purpose guiding scientists through the mountains.
Géologiste studying strange rock formation.
Naturalists collecting plants unknown in the east. Army expeditions mapping new territories. These aging frontiersmen possessed knowledge that no textbook could provide. Where hidden springs flowed during drought, which passes remained open after early storms. Many of America's first accurate maps owed as much to these experienced guides as to the surveyors who later published them. Their knowledge became part of the country's growing understanding of the West. Yet fame rarely followed. Most mountain men died with little wealth. They left behind no grand estates, no monuments, no political careers. Their greatest achievements could not be measured in money. Instead, they had expanded the boundaries of what people believed possible. They proved that humans could survive in places once considered unreachable. They crossed deserts that appeared endless. They climbed mountains that seemed impassable. They followed rivers no American maps had yet recorded. Many never expected history to remember them. They simply lived the only life they knew. Today, hikers walking remote trails in the Rockies sometimes discover traces of that forgotten era. A rusted trap buried beneath leaves. Fragments of an old campfire ring. A weathered horseshoe half hidden beneath the soil. Perhaps an abandoned cabin slowly collapsing into the forest. These small discoveries remind us that long before modern roads and national parks, others walked these same paths, often alone, often unnoticed, always uncertain what waited beyond the next ridge. The mountain men left few written records. Their true legacy survives instead in the landscapes they explored, the trails they opened, the maps they inspired, and the stories that continue to capture the imagination of those who dream of wild places. The American frontier had changed forever, but the spirit of exploration. As the 19th century moved forward, America entered a new age. Railroads stretched across the plains. Telegraph wires connected distant cities. Steam engines replaced long wagon caravans. The wilderness that had once required months to cross could now be reached in days. For younger generations, the stories of the mountain men already sounded like tales from another world. Children growing up in the 1860s and 1870s had never seen the annual rendezvous. They had never watched a trapper disappear into the Rockies carrying nothing more than a rifle, a horse, and a handful of steel traps. Many could hardly imagine such a life. Yet the influence of the mountain men remained everywhere. The routes they discovered became highways. Their camps became settlements. Their trading posts evolved into thriving frontier towns. Even the names they gave to rivers, valleys, and mountain passes appeared on official maps. Their footsteps had quietly shaped the geography of an expanding nation. Perhaps nowhere was their influence greater than in the great overland trails. The Oregon Trail, the California Trail, the Mormon Trail. Millions of Americans know these names today. Few realize that long before thousands of wagons crossed them, many of those routes had first been explored by solitary trappers searching for beaver streams. The mountain men had unknowingly become the first pathfinders of Western migration. Their understanding of water sources, grazing land, winter passes, and dangerous river crossings saved countless lives. Without that knowledge, westward expansion would have been slower, more dangerous, and far more uncertain. Even the United States Army depended heavily upon former mountain men. No printed map could compete with someone who had spent 20 years living among the mountains. Jim Bridger continued guiding expeditions well into later life. Kit Carson became one of the most respected scouts in the American Southwest. Their knowledge became part of the foundation upon which the modern American West was built. One far less visible. Dark forests hid unknown dangers. Towering mountains seemed like barriers standing in the way of civilization. The wilderness represented uncertainty. The mountain men changed that perception. Through their stories, journals, and explorations, Americans slowly began to see wild landscapes not merely as obstacles, but as places of extraordinary beauty. Snow-covered peaks, crystal-clear rivers, endless forests, immense valleys. These places inspired curiosity rather than fear. Generations later, that changing attitude would help lead to the creation of America's first national parks. Yellowstone, Yosemite, Grand Teton, Glacier. Although the mountain men could never have imagined modern conservation, their adventures encouraged people to value landscapes that earlier generations had considered empty or dangerous. Yet history is rarely simple. The same trails that opened opportunity also accelerated profound change. As settlers arrived, indigenous nations faced enormous pressure. Traditional hunting grounds disappeared. Ancient ways of life were disrupted. Conflict spread across much of the frontier. The story of the American West became one of extraordinary achievement and tremendous loss. The mountain men stood at the very beginning of that transformation. They did not create every change that followed, but they witnessed its first chapters. Today, historians increasingly recognize this complexity. The mountain men were explorers. They were entrepreneurs. They were survivors. But they were also participants in a much larger story involving indigenous nations, international trade, government expansion, and environmental change. Understanding their world requires seeing all of those perspectives together. Only then does the true history emerge, not as legend alone, but as the remarkable story of ordinary people living through extraordinary times. Long after the final trap had rusted, long after the last rendezvous ended, their legacy continued flowing quietly through American history, like the mountain rivers they had followed so many years before. Time has a remarkable way of changing the landscape. Rivers continue to flow. Mountains continue to rise above the clouds. Forests grow, burn, and grow again. Nature moves forward with quiet patience. Human history, however, often leaves only faint traces behind. The silence feels timeless. Pine trees sway gently in the wind. Snowmelt rushes over smooth stones. Golden eagles circle high above the valleys. At first glance, it appears untouched. Somewhere beneath the soil rests the rusted jaw of an old beaver trap. A forgotten horseshoe lies hidden beneath layers of fallen leaves. An abandoned campsite, almost invisible beneath grass and wildflowers, marks a place where weary trappers once gathered around a small fire after weeks alone in the wilderness. Nature has reclaimed almost everything. The mountain men left behind few buildings, few monuments, few written records. Their greatest legacy survives in something far less obvious: knowledge. Every dangerous river crossing they identified, every mountain pass they discovered, every valley they carefully mapped, eventually became part of the growing understanding of the American West. Modern highways often follow routes first traveled by horses. Railroads crossed valleys once explored by lonely trappers. Entire cities now stand where only temporary camps once existed. It is easy to forget how uncertain these places once seemed. Before accurate maps, before weather forecasts, before bridges, before roads, crossing the Rockies required something difficult to describe today: faith. Not necessarily religious faith, but faith in one's own ability. Faith that another valley existed beyond the next mountain. Faith that tomorrow's hunt would provide food. Faith that winter would eventually end. Every morning demanded courage. Every evening offered gratitude. The wilderness rewarded preparation, punished arrogance. Many mountain men understood this lesson better than anyone. The mountains could never truly be conquered, only respected. Even the most experienced trapper occasionally became lost. Even the finest horse stumbled. Even the strongest hunter depended upon whether he could never control. Nature always held the final word. Perhaps that is why so many former mountain men struggled after returning to settled communities. Cities operated by clocks. The wilderness operated by seasons. In towns, people hurried. In the mountains, patience often meant survival. A storm could delay travel for days. A frozen river determined the route. An early snowfall changed every plan. Life followed nature's rhythm, not man's schedule. Some mountain men never successfully adjusted. Whenever possible, they returned west. Not because money waited there, but because part of themselves remained among the mountains. There, beneath enormous skies, they had discovered a rare kind of freedom. One impossible to purchase. One impossible to explain. Many modern visitors still experience a small piece of that feeling. Watching sunrise touch distant peaks. Listening to nothing except flowing water and wind through evergreen forests. For just a moment, the modern world seems wonderfully far away. It becomes easier to understand why so many mountain men willingly endured hunger, cold, loneliness, and danger. They were not simply chasing beavers. The feeling of living where every sunrise brought a new horizon, where every trail disappeared into mystery, where the map ended, an adventure began. Although the frontier itself has vanished, that feeling has never entirely disappeared. Still waits quietly, among the rivers, the forests, and the endless mountains of the American West. As another long day faded into evening, the mountains slowly surrendered to twilight. Far below, a narrow river reflected the final light of the sun as it wound quietly through the valley. A cool breeze carried the familiar scent of pine, sage, and distant snow. Somewhere nearby, an elk called into the gathering darkness. Silence returned. For countless generations, evenings like this had come and gone without witnesses. Long before settlers, long before maps gave these mountains familiar names, nature had always followed its own patient rhythm. Tonight, beside a small campfire, an aging mountain man sat alone. His horse grazed peacefully nearby, occasionally lifting its head before returning to the sweet mountain grass. There was no urgency anymore. No race to reach another river before sunrise. No company expecting another bundle of beaver pelts. No distant rendezvous waiting beyond the mountains. He stared into the dancing flames, watching sparks drift upward toward a sky slowly filling with stars. Another river crossed. Another winter survived. Another friend whose laughter had long since faded into history. He remembered the first time he had entered these mountains. He had been young then, strong, certain that adventure waited around every bend in the trail. The wilderness had seemed endless. Every valley promised discovery. Every distant peak invited exploration. He remembered crossing icy rivers with numb hands, sleeping beneath heavy snowfall, following buffalo across open plains that stretched farther than the eye could see. He remembered nights when wolves circled the edge of camp, mornings when frost covered every blanket, afternoons when an unexpected rainbow appeared after violent mountain storms. He remembered friends. Some returned east. Some settled in hidden valleys. Some never came home. Then, from conversation, eventually, only the mountains remembered them. He smiled softly as another memory surfaced. The laughter around the rendezvous. The music. The stories that grew more unbelievable with every passing year. Young trappers trying to impress seasoned veterans. Old friends reunited after months of complete isolation. For a little while, the wilderness had become a small village beneath enormous skies. Those days had passed. The mountains remained. But the world surrounding them had changed forever. Somewhere beyond the horizon, trains now crossed the plains. Telegraph wires carried messages faster than any horse could ride. New towns appeared every season. Children born in those settlements would never know the wilderness as it once had been. And perhaps that was simply the way of history. Every generation inherits a different world. The fire burned lower. The stars grew brighter. The same constellations watched over indigenous hunters, Spanish explorers, mountain men, and someday, those yet to come. The old trapper closed his eyes for a moment. Not from exhaustion, but from contentment. He had lived a life that few could imagine. A life measured not by wealth, but by rivers crossed, mountains climbed, friendships earned, and mornings welcomed beneath open skies. The fire crackled gently. The river continued its endless journey toward distant valleys. Nothing hurried. Nothing demanded attention. The wilderness simply existed, as it always had. And for one peaceful evening, so did he. Morning returned quietly. Long before the first rays of sunlight reached the valley floor, the mountains were already awake. Somewhere high above, an eagle left its nest and circled effortlessly through the pale sky. The old mountain man rose slowly from beside the fading campfire. The fire had become little more than glowing embers. In the wilderness, a careless fire could destroy an entire forest. Respect for the land had always come before convenience. That lesson had been learned many years before. Together they had crossed deserts, climbed frozen passes, and survived storms powerful enough to erase entire trails. Neither moved with the speed they once had. Age had slowed them both. But there was no longer any need to hurry. The mountains had taught him that nature never rushed. The seasons arrived in their own time. Snow melted when it was ready. The wind answered to no one. Perhaps people were meant to live the same way. For a few moments he simply stood overlooking the valley. The view stretched for miles. Towering peaks framed the horizon. Morning sunlight slowly touched their snowy summits. Golden light flowed downward across forests, rivers, and open meadows. It was the same sunrise he had watched hundreds of times. Yet somehow, it never looked exactly the same. Every season changed the mountains. Every storm reshaped the rivers. Every passing year left small marks that only careful eyes could notice. That was another lesson the wilderness had given him. Not the forests, not the rivers, not the animals, and certainly not people. He remembered when this valley had echoed with the sound of beavers splashing into the water at dusk. He remembered watching enormous herds of buffalo darken the distant plains. He remembered evenings when the only human voices belonged to a handful of trappers gathered around a lonely fire. Now, far beyond the mountains, church bells rang in growing towns. Steam engines crossed the prairie. Children attended schools built where forests once stood. History had continued its steady march. The old world had quietly stepped aside. He felt no anger, only understanding. Every generation believes its own world will last forever. Few ever do. The mountain men had once believed the fur trade would continue without end. The great rendezvous seemed permanent. The rivers appeared endless. The wilderness felt too vast to ever change. Yet change had come. Slowly at first. Looking back, it almost seemed impossible how quickly everything had happened. Only 40 years earlier, much of this land had been a mystery to most Americans. Now maps filled schoolrooms across the country. The blank spaces were gone. Names had replaced uncertainty. Roads had replaced game trails. Bridges crossed rivers that once required days of searching for a safe ford. Progress had brought opportunity. It had also taken something away. The old trapper understood both truths could exist together. One did not erase the other. It had stood there long before his first journey west. It would likely remain standing long after he was gone. There was comfort in that thought. People passed. Mountains endured. He climbed into the saddle one final time that morning. No destination waited ahead. No buyer expected pelts. No expedition required a guide. He rode simply because riding through the mountains still felt like home. The trail curved gently through the forest. Sunlight filtered between ancient trees. Birdsong echoed through the cool morning air. For anyone watching from a distance, it would have appeared as though the wilderness itself was slowly carrying one of its oldest friends home. And perhaps that is exactly what it was doing. The day slowly faded into evening once more. Golden light slipped behind the western peaks. Long shadows stretched across the quiet valley. Nothing hurried. Nothing demanded attention. The mountains simply breathed. Perhaps that is why people have always been drawn to wild places. Not because they promise comfort. Instead, the wilderness transformed them, taught patience, humility, resilience. It rewarded careful observation more than reckless courage. It reminded every traveler that survival depended not upon strength alone, but upon respect. Respect for the weather, respect for the rivers, respect for the animals, respect for the people who had called these mountains home long before newcomers ever arrived. That lesson may be the greatest legacy they left behind. Not the maps, not the trails, not the stories, but the understanding that nature is never truly owned, only borrowed for a little while. As darkness settles gently across the Rockies, imagine the final campfires burning low beneath the stars. One by one, their glowing embers fade. The conversations grow quieter. The horses rest peacefully. The wind carries the scent of pine through the forest. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf calls into the night. Another answers. The sound echoes across valleys exactly as it did centuries before the first mountain men arrived. Exactly as it does today. Above, the night sky reveals thousands upon thousands of stars. Without city lights, the heavens appear endless. The Milky Way stretches across the darkness like a silver river flowing overhead. Those same stars guided indigenous hunters. They guided explorers. They guided lonely trappers crossing frozen mountain passes in the middle of winter. They continue to shine with quiet indifference to the passing of human history. Empires rise. Empires fall. Roads appear. Roads disappear. Generations come and go. Yet the mountains remain. Patient. Silent. Enduring. Somewhere, beneath towering pines, forgotten trails still wind through the forest. Old beaver ponds continue to shape quiet streams. Snow still gathers on distant peaks each winter before melting into rivers each spring. Nature continues the ancient rhythm it has always known. And perhaps, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the faint footsteps of a lone rider disappearing beyond the next ridge. Not racing. Not searching for fortune. His story has ended. But the mountains continue. Their rivers continue. Their forests continue. Their silence continues. Thank you for sharing this journey through one of the most remarkable chapters in American history. Now, allow the cool mountain air to grow softer. Allow the sound of the flowing river to become gentler. The horses are calm. The forest is still. The stars shine above. There is nowhere left to travel tonight. Nothing more to carry. Nothing more to prove. Only quiet. Only the timeless wilderness. May your thoughts become as calm as the mountain lakes. May your breathing become as gentle as the evening breeze moving through the pines. And may your dreams wander safely along those forgotten trails, where the rivers still whisper, the mountains still stand, and somewhere beyond the trees, the spirit of the American mountain man quietly rides on. Good night.